Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. Welcome to the Center for Strategic Philanthropy at the Judge Business School inside the University of Cambridge. Welcome to our series of webinars on the topic of Shift the Power. And welcome to the specific seminar today where we're going to be talking about revolutionizing transparency in the third sector, driving better decisions, legitimacy, and goodwill. So in today's session, we hope to be exploring many aspects of transparency, something that's been discussed a huge amount in our sector for many decades, but really trying to look specifically at some of the practical impacts of improving transparency, looking at how better transparency can help us build communities, learn from the mistakes of the past, encourage donors to be more accountable, encourage collaboration to drive more impact, and encourage sharing, just sharing across our community, something that COVID has really shown us is absolutely essential. So we're going to be exploring multiple aspects of transparency and how we can radically transform it and change it in line with that dynamic of shifting the power. So before we start, a little bit of housekeeping. So we would like you all, of course, this is a very interactive session, so please do share your questions, get your questions ready. We have the opportunity for you to upvote them in the chat box because we're very democratic, so it won't just be the person who sends the most questions. There will be the opportunity for this community to vote for the best question. I will be fielding the questions to our audience shortly. And we will also have the whole recording of this event online. So if you do have to jump off without getting to the end, which we very much hope you don't, please do revisit the recording on our YouTube channel later. And we would also encourage you all to sign up to our social media accounts and share. Feel free to live tweet the event today. We've got 4 brilliant speakers who I know will be saying some excellent points that if you want to share with your networks, then please do live tweet the event. So really, really delighted to have with us today. As with all of our events, we spend quite a bit of time making sure that we get the most influential leaders on these debates, in these discussions, people that have been working in the field of philanthropy for many years and who are very much aligned with this idea, especially in the world of COVID, that philanthropy is changing and needs to change. But how do we change it? So delighted to have with us today Briggs Bomba, who is joining us from Africa. He's the programs director for TrustAfrica. We have also with us Naila Farouky, who is the CEO of the Arab Foundations Forum, a regional network of in the Arab world. We have Caroline Fiennes, who's the director of Giving Evidence in the UK and also a fellow at our center. And we have Brian San, who is the executive director of the Wealth Management Institute based in Singapore. And you'll be hearing more about these individual organizations shortly as we kick off the debate. Just wanted to confirm why we at the center, hosting this series of events. We ourselves did research on the impact of COVID-19 in emerging markets. That's our focus at the Center for Strategic Philanthropy. We look specifically at emerging markets and therein the Arab world, Africa, and Southeast Asia. We discovered in our own work that there was a real focus during COVID, at the very beginning, during, and hopefully as we get after the COVID, get through the pandemic, of how power dynamics have impacted philanthropic impact over the years. And a real appetite to change the way power dynamics have been structured over the years, with a real focus on local communities, local contributions, local knowledge, local data, peer networks, and really shifting that power from the perhaps historical purse strings of philanthropy in the global north to really look at what is coming out of the global south in terms of innovation, in terms of new ways of doing things, new practices within the philanthropic sector. So that's really what inspired this series of events. We also, as we started to continue our research on this particular area, the dynamic the power dynamics within philanthropy, we came across like-minded organizations who had already been working on this issue of shifting power dynamics for many years. Indeed, there is now, it started as a hashtag, as so many things do, hashtag shift the power, but it is now actually a full-blown website that kicked off in May 2021. And there is a growing community around this idea of shifting power dynamics that is particularly vociferous in the markets that we look at. So as I said, the Arab world, Southeast Asia, and Africa. Just one final point on that before we go to our polls is that this is a series of events. We would like to build our community in this space and encourage those of you that are participating today and have historically participated to stay connected, to give us feedback on how we can support the growth of this kind of discourse. What is it that we need to change? How can we change it? And how can we at the Center for Strategic Philanthropy be instrumental in supporting philanthropists in the Global South? And I want to come first to Briggs. So Briggs, obviously as the program director for TrustAfrica, you've done some amazing work across the continent. You're very much seen as a leader in this space and talking beyond philanthropy, actually talking more generally about how transparency within aid flows, within government funding, within the private sector funding. Talk to us a little bit about how the focus of transparency has shifted from the old school thinking of just, we need to know who's giving what to whom, to a much more broader philosophical and perhaps political discussion.
Thank you, Claire, and the Center for Strategic Philanthropy for the invitation to be part of this very important conversation, not just for the philanthropy space, but I would say for the whole development sector. TrustAfrica, the foundation that I represent as the programs director, is founded on a mission to strengthen African agency in solving the continent's most pressing challenges. Another way of putting it is that we believe that for us to have relevant, effective, durable solutions, those who are most affected by the problems that we are seeking to solve must have agency in the solutions that we put forward. So the conversation around transparency for us is a conversation that takes us to the fundamental aspect of leveling the playing field, particularly in terms of the entrenched power that financial capital has in the development space versus the power of change agents on the ground, or the communities that are affected by the problems that we are seeking to solve. So when you talk about transparency going beyond just sharing information, we completely concur, because at its essence, transparency is about empowering the communities that philanthropy is serving to be able not only to understand the thinking, the rationale, the calculations that philanthropic actors are coming with, but it's empowerment in the sense of enabling the actors on the ground to be able to inform, to be able to actually contribute. Because what happens is, if you are transparent, just even at the level of sharing information, you are actually extending an invitation for people to comment on your approaches, on your decisions, on your strategies, the impact that you are having, on the ground. So we believe that transparency really takes us to that place where we are talking about strengthening the agency of those who are most affected by the problems that we are seeking to solve. And it's only through strengthening that agency that we will be able to get to a place where those who are most affected are central in setting priorities. They are central in informing the approaches. They are also central in validating the impact that philanthropy has or philanthropy can claim at the end of the day. So we consider transparency to be, essential, to be fundamental. But beyond that, we think that the highest level of transparency actually is inclusion. It's inclusion in the sense of bringing those that we are seeking to serve into our planning, bringing those that we are seeking to serve into our strategizing, bringing those we are seeking to serve into our decision-making structures, bringing those that we are seeking to serve and help into setting priorities, bringing them into even how, our activities. So the highest level of transparency from our perspective is really including those who are most affected, those who are, those that we are seeking to serve. And we believe that at the end of the day, this is about improved decision-making. It's also about improved outcomes, from philanthropic activities at the end of the day. So I can leave it at that for now, Claire, but quite keen to share more on that.
Yes, that's brilliant. Thank you, Briggs. You've done an excellent job of summarizing exactly that kind of shift that we've seen over the last couple of years, where the conversation around transparency has really moved away. Historically, it was kind of like, well, how come we don't know enough about who's spending money where? Around, as you say, around transparency for agency, making sure that the people on the ground who are actually receiving funding, potentially going to be deploying these resources, actually have voice. And indeed, that was very much the essence of why our center was created, about really creating a voice in the global south around. And as you say, quite simply because that helps create impact, right? If you're getting input from people on the ground who have local knowledge and agency, then that is going to collectively help us all improve impact. And something that COVID has, highlighted. Another thing that we saw under COVID, which takes us nicely to Naila, is this whole acceleration of digital, which perhaps seemed something kind of very technical in the beginning, simply the fact that we all went on Zoom. But actually, when we looked into it deeper, was also contributing to much greater data sharing, and data sharing across communities that perhaps historically hadn't been as connected as they were, often for the wrong reasons, that the pandemic demanded this kind of new level of information. We needed to know where to get the money and how could we do it quickly to support those communities that were worst hit. But Naila, I think data has really been at the heart of the AFF's work in the last few years, where you have been trying very much to promote transparency in the Arab philanthropic community, but also in terms of building that community. Talk to us a little bit more about your work in this space.
Sure. Thank you so much, Claire. Yeah. So, I mean, I was listening to everything that Briggs was saying and kind of like nodding in agreement pretty much to everything that he was talking about, particularly around this idea of, allowing agency for local communities. And so this is an interesting thing because, as you said, I've been kind of obsessed with this idea of what, of how does transparency and accountability fit into the Arab context. And we've talked a lot about, what does that context look like? Why is there a lack of transparency and accountability? And so I always have them, I always kind of envision them as this trifecta of these obstacles that we have to, the dragon that we have to slay, which is around the challenge of the lack of data, but then also exploring or interrogating why is there a lack of data. And I've found over the last couple of years that really that lack isn't just due to the lack of will to provide data, but there are some more complicated reasons behind it. One, if you look specifically at the philanthropy sector, that there is a very close connection between the valuation of philanthropic giving to the anonymity of that giving. So, because within a religious context, we know that a lot of Arab giving is made with within that construct. So there's a reason that's not as sinister as people sometimes may point to. And then there are some more challenging reasons, which include this lack of trust between government agencies and the sector, civil society sector at large, not just the philanthropy sector. And we've been interrogating a lot about what is what is that lack of trust due to? We have some, we have some theories, but then also how can we mitigate this issue? And one of them is around, again, all roads lead back to having a little bit more data, because if we have more data, we're able to build a stronger narrative. We're able to build a narrative that positions the sector a little bit more positively. And then again, even, to expand a little bit on what Briggs was saying, the only way that we can have agency as local communities is if we own the data, because that data allows us to own the narrative, which then allows us to shape the story. And then we are telling our own story, right? So part of what this has been kind of, what I've been mulling over in my head, and then I ended up reading this book that I just finished a couple of days ago, which is, there's a reason for this, but it's this book written by an ex-CIA analyst. His name is Martin Gurry. So I just, disclaimer at the very top, it was written by a former CIA analyst, but the book is called The Revolt of the Public and the Crisis of Authority in the New Millennium, okay? And it's very interesting because it really does it gave me a lot of food for thought about this specific discussion. The book essentially tries to examine, what are the drivers against, or the drivers of revolt from the public against authority. And of course, there's no way to, particularly in the last 20 years, there's no way to ignore the access to digital platforms and that kind of global access to digital platforms. And then this illusion of the democratization of information, this illusion of democratizing the platforms that allow people to think they have agency. But in fact, if you're on the book-ended sides of that authority, you have the authority to allow this illusion, but then you also have the authority to squash it, right? And I think for me, what this book was doing, particularly as I was thinking about how it relates to this conversation around transparency and accountability, one of the issues that we face in the Arab region, outside of the lack of the data that we are providing, is also that lack of the expectation of accountability and transparency, right? So generally speaking, we don't have an expectation that our governments are going to be accountable and transparent to us. And so we also have this conflict of, well, then why do we as a sector need to be the more forthcoming and the more open? And it has forced this reckoning of the power of the structures that drive and govern the trajectory of aid and development, right? And so we've been also thinking a lot about the conversation around the decolonization of aid, the decolonization of development. And that, of course, fits in perfectly with the Shift the Power movement, right? So we, for our purposes, so that we can better understand how we can empower our sector in the region to be a little bit more active and participant in its own metamorphosis in a way, we have tried, and Clare, you know this because Clare used to chair the AFF board for a very long time, and every time her term would end, we would ask her to stay on because we just needed to keep this momentum going. But we've tried to launch a data survey in so many different iterations at so many different points in time since I came on to AFF, at least in 2014. And finally, the stars aligned. We were approached by Dahlberg Advisors, which is a consulting firm who was interested in understanding a little bit more about the ecosystem of philanthropy, specifically in the Arab region, because they have a very big office in the Arab region. They came to us, to AFF, to ask if we would be interested in launching what we've now discovered is really the only one of its kind, the most comprehensive, in-depth, deep dive data survey of Arab giving that has ever actually been launched. And the only reason we were able to do that is because we are coming together with different partners. And then we've grown that partnership to actually include the Center for Strategic Philanthropy, as well as Philanthropy Age, which as a knowledge partner. So that's one of the ways that for our purposes, we're hoping that we'll be able to at least start a conversation, but start that conversation from a place of information, from a place of knowledge.
Thanks for that, Naila. And I want to come back to Briggs at some point around the reflection of that in Africa, about Africa-wide. I mean, obviously in the Arab world, despite the heterogeneity, there is still a lot of similarity between markets, and yet still we struggle to get a clear idea of what Arab philanthropy looks like more holistically. And as you said, Naila, also this aversion to data sharing, although again, COVID has triggered a change in that. Something that we found in our work was that COVID was a bit of an epiphany on the part of many governments, including in the Middle East, of the value of philanthropy because there was data being shared. And they suddenly realized that actually this is a great opportunity for governments to work with philanthropists to deal with these entrenched socioeconomic issues. But let's move now to Southeast Asia, to Brian. So Brian, obviously you're in that space where we are also seeing the future of philanthropy. We just did our executive education program, huge interest in this space around blended finance, impact investing, bringing different sources of capital together. And I guess we kind of assume that if you are mixing philanthropic capital with more commercial capital in kind of the wealth management space, that there are going to be certain standards that will have to be met in terms of things like disclosure. But more broadly, talk to us about how you see transparency impacting the opportunity of philanthropic growth in Southeast Asia. And within that context, really, of the kind of the continuum of capital, where you're seeing commercial capital partner with philanthropic capital for blended finance opportunities.
Absolutely. Firstly, thanks so much for having me. And for those who might not know as much about who we are, so I'm Brian. I'm with the Wealth Management Institute in Singapore. We're a nonprofit institute founded by the Singapore state investors GIC and Temasek, and we conduct research education programs for the financial sector, central banks, and family offices in particular. And I think especially with family offices, we've really seen exactly what Claire has been saying. There's tremendous growth in the sector, and to be fair, a lot of tremendous wealth growth in the sector in this part of the world as well. And that has really fueled a lot of interest, not just in philanthropy, but across this spectrum, going to impact investing, ESG, sustainable investing, and more innovative ways of financing. What I found really interesting about this transparency conversation, and it's a fantastic opportunity for Southeast Asia in that if we talk about global South philanthropists, such a nascent group. I mean, philanthropy has been around for some time, but I would structured philanthropy and this way of much more with this blending with sort of financial capital. I think this whole more structured, more maybe finance-driven approach is fairly new. And there's a lot of, personally, I'm quite looking forward to this, learning from everyone else on this panel about great lessons that we could take from the other parts of the world. One thing I did notice about transparency is that it's communication. It's a conversation, and it's about sharing information, sharing data. With any communication, you need people who know how to listen, and you need people who know how to speak. In terms of listening, we need the philanthropist to, as sort of Briggs and Naila have been saying, we need them to understand the nonprofits on the ground, give them that agency to have that level of inclusion. But the interesting thing is, on the other side, we also need the nonprofits to be able to communicate the good work that they do. And I think this whole conversation of transparency assumes almost that they know how to do that, but may not always uniformly be the case. How to communicate their story most effectively, how to share data in a way that the philanthropist understands, and in a way that aids that philanthropic decision making at the start. Particularly acute when you bring in investors or people with an investment background into the mix. I think nothing is more painful than seeing a wealthy family office, private equity, venture capital approach to all my due diligence questions and loading that onto a nonprofit or an agency which is doing great work on the ground, but might not have that capability or experience to tell that story effectively. So to me, a fundamental enabler of transparency needs to be a leveling up also of the capabilities within the sector on both sides of the coin. We need to educate the philanthropists on different ways of including, making philanthropy a lot more participatory, but we also need to help the nonprofits sort of tell that story, or at least give a common set of data and metrics that they know are important, or else you just have too big a dispersion of information, some of which may be useful, some of which may not.
And that, of course, has been a common theme throughout both our research work and these seminars, the idea of building capacity with, be it social enterprises or not-for-profit organizations, in being able to A, collect the data, B, disseminate it, and C, really build a narrative around that. So I think a very important point, Brian, if we're going to attract more money into the sector, and we know there is growth, intergenerational wealth transfers, particularly in Southeast Asia, are trillions, exactly. So there is growth in this space, but in order to get it into the sector and in the right way that we create agency and we create communities is going to be a challenge. So let's come to Caroline. And so Caroline, you've been looking at this also for many, many years, and you've been a very vocal critique of the sector in terms of how we disclose information and to the extent to which we use evidence to build interventions. And recently you've taken it upon yourself to develop a tool from publicly disclosable data that can help hold organizations to account. So tell us more about perhaps some of your historical work in this space and what you're working on now. After you unmute, which I can actually do for you.
I've done that twice today. Sorry, it's only been a year and a half now. Yeah, thanks, Claire, and thanks to the Cambridge Centre for organising this important session. So just on the background, so Giving Evidence is an organisation based in the UK, but we work in many countries and on many issues, and we do various things, including advising donors and funders. So sometimes that is literally, who should I write my check to? And other times it is more questions around strategy and structure. And I mention that because we might come back, I might talk about some specific experiences that we've had with donors, particular donors and foundations, about trying to get them to be more transparent and inclusive, and some of the barriers that we've seen to that. One of which relates to the question in the chat, actually, about why don't Northern funders fund more grassroots organizations. The project that Claire refers to, I'll just talk about that, is about UK-based grant-making foundations only, but I'm going to tell you about it because it might be kind of analogous to some issues in moving power across borders. So, as you can imagine, lots of UK grant-making foundations are run by white people and, middle-class white people like me, and, fairly wealthy people, and they're very agreeable jobs, and because you don't have to fundraise, basically. And the boards, the trustees, tend to be white and fairly affluent and basically completely different to the kinds of people that they're trying to fund, actually. And there's been a million conversations about how do we improve diversity and how do we, all of that. But there's not really been much movement. I think it's the case that about 3 years ago, there was only one foundation in the UK which had both a chief executive and a chair of colour. And so we decided to create a rating to publicly assess grant-making foundations on their diversity, accountability, and transparency. And we are just starting to create this. We haven't got any results yet. We announced it. It was 3 years in the cooking. There are 10 funders who are supporting it. And we are just using publicly available information. So we are researching, and we are going to produce a rating, an assessment of UK grant-making foundations individually on their accountability, diversity, and transparency. And we are using only their publicly available information. That is the information that a prospective applicant or somebody might use. And we are going to publish it, and we're going to do it year on year. And so the innovation, or the unusual part about this, is that it is an assessment of foundations that the foundations do not control. So if you are aware, for example, of the Center for Effective Philanthropy in the US, they will run grantee perception reports. And those are great. I used to be on CEP's advisory board, whatever. But the foundation decides if it's going to commission that. And so there's a selection effect in the foundation that there's a selection effect or selection bias in the foundations that choose to get those kinds of surveys. But with ours, we are choosing which foundations we assess, and we're choosing that randomly, doing a random selection of UK foundations. And so it is deliberately about, I don't know if it's about moving power to the intended beneficiaries or to the grantees, but it's about creating a stronger incentive for them to be open and transparent. The criteria that we're using are all public. We ran a public consultation to determine what they would be. We are kind of experimenting with them now. And they do include things like, is there a mechanism for making complaints? Does this organization publish information about the breakdown of its staff and trustees by gender and race and so on? And how accessible are its materials? So hopefully that will provide more of an incentive for foundations. And as I say, we're starting with foundations in the UK, but if anybody wants to replicate this initiative anywhere else, then I am very happy about that.
Thank you, Caroline. And I think that's a great invitation for us to go global with it and support you through this community. Briggs, I'm dying to come back to you to hear your thoughts on what you've heard from your fellow panelists and on Caroline's idea that you might do something like this in Africa. I'm going to unmute. There you go. There you go. Fire away. Yeah, it's the good old mute button.
Yeah, no, a lot of resonance from what, my fellow panelists are sharing. And you had flagged the element of data, sharing data and how that plays out in the context of African philanthropy. And I think it's important that we sort of speak to the fact that we are fighting at a conceptual terrain when it comes to, even definitions, of what African philanthropy is, because it's not the same thing for us as grant making, giving money. We are really looking at trying to understand and conceptualize the aspect of solidarity that is quite embedded in our African culture and practice, the giving that exists in our traditions, and it's a giving that goes, we're talking of more than money. It's time, it's other forms of capital. So even when we talk about data, sharing data, I think it really takes us to really looking seriously at what are we, because what you measure is really what you grow, right? Or what you value. So it takes us to a whole value system, like what are we valuing? And I think even at the heart of this conversation about transparency and the shifting of power away from the very entrenched power position of financial capital, the privilege that financial capital has in philanthropy, to beginning to surface and express and acknowledge other forms of capital that goes into delivering the results that we celebrate at the end of the day, I think becomes very important in the context of discussing African philanthropy. The giving of time, the giving of space, the giving of trust capital, the giving of networks, the giving, that goes beyond money becomes critical. So I think when we start to center transparency, it invites that conversation that enables us to see communities, movements, movement leaders as co-investors, not just as recipients of philanthropic investments, but they are also co-investors because their giving is part of philanthropy. So I think conceptually, we are sort of pursuing a definition of philanthropy on the continent that really goes beyond finance. But sharing data, as you've put forward, becomes really critical. But our own encouragement and our own experience is that we need to have a wide scope. And we need to look at this. I think the way that Brian was, talking about it, that it's a conversation. It's a two-way street. So we need to look at it as the invitation I spoke about at the beginning. It's, you are sharing this so that you get response, and from that response you are building a relationship. There's mutual accountability that is implied, that comes into the equation, and it goes beyond, because I think we have to be very important. We have to be very careful when we look at the aspects of data, because sometimes if we're not that careful, it ends up being a one-sided conversation or a one-way street. From our own experience, some of the biggest issues that need to be that philanthropy needs to be transparent about, for example, are the internal struggles that philanthropic workers and philanthropic organizations go through, their own challenges, their own limitations that they go through, because you have an assumption that if you are the one coming holding money, it's almost like you're coming from a perfect place and the due diligence is on the recipient. So the transparency we're talking about must also include at a certain level transparency about, look, we are foundation so and so, these are the challenges that we are going through. Some of them are to do with just contextual appreciation. Some of them are even operational. Some of governance. Some of them are, we just have a crazy founder who wants, to go in this particular direction that does not reflect the reality on the ground. So being transparent about that creates a relationship of trust, creates a situation where even your partners on the ground are able to understand some of the shifts that then happen. And even some of the language that we use, people come, you are supposed to be working together on a 10-year project, because social change takes such a long time. People come in within 6 months, now talking about a dignified exit, and it completely disrupts everything that partners on the ground are doing, because partners on the ground are invested in this. They've got nowhere to run to. And I think that's what we saw with COVID, when even some of the philanthropic actors could exit. Community leaders, community organizations remained, those proximate actors remained on the ground to have the kind of impact that was required.
Absolutely. And we had several examples of that in our research, where organizations on the ground realized that navigating, securing additional funding from complex philanthropic organizations was so onerous that they were going to try and create local peer lending and peer funding and just peer work to offset that gap. And I'm sure, Naila, that resonates for you as well in the Arab world when we talk about lexicon, language, narrative, how the Arab world is perceived and is able to present. And you've had various experiences of dealing perhaps with some international donor organizations and having to spend time, help them understand the context on the ground. Give us your reaction to what Briggs is saying about what's happening in Africa.
I mean, I feel like Briggs should just speak on my behalf and then I'll just nod next to him because everything he says resonates so perfectly. But yeah, so, again, just the other night, I think it was the day before yesterday, I hosted this dinner in Cairo with the UN, what's his title? The UN High-Level Champion for Climate Action, okay? Because the COP27, the UN's climate conference is happening in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt in next year, which is a really big deal because it's the first time that any African bloc country gets to host one of the COPs. So anyway, this guy is an appointed official, appointed by the UK government because the UK Glasgow is hosting COP26 this year, and this was his first time in Egypt. And he's been working in this space for a very long time, both in private sector and public sector, and has been running an NGO for a couple of years before he took on this appointed position. And it's his first time in Egypt, and he was, the first day right before he came to our dinner, had been meeting around with a number of different ministers around Cairo. And, it's very interesting, his reaction. So I often kind of measure my reaction based on the reaction of someone who's just looking at this for the very first time. And of course, one of the reasons why he's coming to Cairo now was to kind of get a feel for what is the ecosystem looking like, who are the players that are, addressing climate emergency in Egypt, to kind of set them up so that, when they host next year. And he said, I walked into these meetings and I've come into this country for the very first time. And he was like, honestly, I'm shocked at how much we don't realize how colonialist our mindsets are when we think we're exposed, we think we've seen different perspectives, we think we know what we're talking about. And he's like, and then I walk in and all these things that I take for granted, meaning freedom of civil society, freedom of expression, freedom of moving money, freedom of banking, having your banking systems be in a way allowing you to kind of like thrive and continue. And he's like, and I looked, I'm looking around and he's like, this is day one. And all the conversations so far kind of negate everything that I took to be true. And what was interesting to me about that is, first of all, that it's very rare to see that kind of introspection. So most of the conversations that I've been on the receiving end of with folks in that kind of position have been very dismissive, and kind of, brushing everything with big, broad strokes and not at all taking context into account. And B was interesting because I was, you're sort of watching someone reconsider their own expectations and their own understanding in real time. And I just kept thinking, you guys are coming to set up something that's going to happen in a year. You don't have time in this year to understand all of the different. And so so the third kind of reflection that I had on that was, good for you for reaching out at least to a local entity that can bring you together with people that can actually inform you, so that you're not doing your desktop research sitting in an office, in I think he's in Dover, if I remember correctly. So like, at least you're giving yourself this kind of edification and allowing people to sit you down and make you listen. Because I think, this is the thing, is that, again, like, we can't break down, we can't deconstruct these structures that are put in our way, that are so restrictive and restrict our movement and restrict our growth, if we're not willing to have, like Briggs was saying, the conversation with the people that it most affects.
Absolutely. And also, if there isn't the data to be able to, share the narrative of, for example, what's happening in the Middle East. I want to come back to Brian on that note, because, we've seen a lot ourselves at the center, this dearth of data on philanthropy in our chosen markets. So, and clearly kind of the onus in the past on transparency was like, well, just share what you're doing before we even get to a broader conversation around empowerment. But is the situation, sometimes we get the impression that in Southeast Asia, the situation is better, that there is more data, there is more digitization, that there is more. Your research is at the center is obviously looking at the sector. How do you think the situation is in Southeast Asia in terms of the availability of data, disclosure of data? Do third sector organizations have capacity to really proactively share data?
I think it's an interesting one, and we see that there's a demarcation, there's a split. Definitely some of the more established ones that have been around for some time, and it's almost a virtuous cycle. You become larger, you attract more donors, you can build capacity to measure the outcomes, you have more data, and so you're able to share, and then it goes on and you attract more. Whereas a lot of the smaller ones, and interestingly, when we talk about COVID has seen an explosion almost of a lot of these really for very hyper local needs in the neighborhoods or in cities, in rural areas that respond, because when government infrastructure breaks down, when there's too many crises, people just wonderfully sort of band together and solve the issue as they see it. And often it's these smaller hyperlocal ones that are responding to these immediate needs that don't have any of this capacity and don't have this infrastructure, and almost they're the ones who need the funding the most, because they've only grown out of this necessity that has come out in the last 1 or 2 years because of the pandemic. And so while a lot of, and it's interesting being on the research organization trying to measure them, because it's easy to become biased towards the ones that have the more data, more information, and really needing to sort of continue the theme of Naila, so open your eyes and trying to see what you're not seeing, and trying to find out more about the bigger picture. One thing I did want to add about Briggs's point, though, about this being able to do due diligence on the foundation side, it just immediately struck me as a almost opposite parallel for what we see in the investing world, in that if you're a very successful or you're a hot startup at the moment, you essentially have your pick of funders, and it's almost you due diligence on the people who you want to take money from, in a sense, and there's a lot more power to the startup or to the entrepreneur who's doing really well. Increasingly, though, as that mindset is shifting to, say, impact investing or sustainable investing, if you're a terrific if you're a terrific social enterprise, terrific impact investing target, you are able to have a little bit of this of that power to choose between, do I take funds from impact investor or a foundation, or there's a lot more interest, and so I feel this shift perhaps towards with more capital looking at more impact type opportunities. Hopefully it helps the power dynamic, the competitive dynamic of there's, and so nonprofits or social enterprises or impact investment companies that will hopefully have more choice and be able to do that diligence on the foundation.
Yeah, absolutely. And as more social purpose organizations pick up that more entrepreneurial model, I guess we just did our first executive education program last week specifically focused on the Arab world, and with a lot of young up-and-coming philanthropists, and the vast majority were looking at enterprise-based models, social enterprise, etc. Definitely, hopefully bodes well, as you say, for their future opportunity to have a more power-enabled conversation with potential funders. I'm going to come to Caroline, but I have some questions here that have been upvoted. So I want to just start opening up the questions because we have quite a few. So we're going to go first to the most popular one today. Is from John, who's asking, why do large organizations not easily work with grassroots organizations? Is it because of transparency in their activities? Caroline, you wanted to give that one a first shot.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I wanted to answer it because it's such I really feel the pain of, organizations doing work on the front line in low middle income countries, and there's all this money and it doesn't go to them, and why not? So I work on the other end of that. I work with some large philanthropic organizations, and I spend a lot of my life advocating for you. Okay, and I spend a lot of my life advocating for people that I've never met, actually, and probably will never meet. And I guess consulting is a lot about power without accountability. Philanthropy is a lot about power without accountability. So I just want to talk about a couple of examples of real funders who I'm working with, having that exact conversation with right now. So one is a large northern organization which funds the production of research, and it's research to influence or to benefit the poor in low-income countries, but most of the organizations that they fund are based in the global north. And we have been talking to them about that. There's plenty of good researchers in the global south, plenty of good researchers in the countries that you want to benefit. So if you want to benefit, Kenya and Uganda, then go fund some researchers in Kenya and Uganda. And I'm not going to defend this, but I'm just going to explain to you some of the reasons that I hear as to why they fund Global North institutions. It's partly that they know them and they are easy to find. It's partly that there is a sort of game, you know, around filling in application forms and dealing with funders. And it is easier to play that game. I think Briggs and Brian touched on this. It's kind of easier to play that game if you have the same sort of educational background and as the people that you're pushing to. Michelle's asking who is the organization. I'm not going to tell you who they are, partly because I'm what I'm saying about them. And there's a thing about like we have a saying here that nobody ever got fired for hiring IBM. You know, that if you fund a prestigious northern university or whatever, it's kind of safe. Like, it might not actually have the most impact, it might not actually be the most consequential, but you're not going to get fired for it. No one's going to wonder whether you've lost your mind in doing that. So these are some of the reasons that it doesn't happen. I absolutely agree with what Brian was saying, that as organizations get bigger, it gets easier for them to hire people to produce the kind of monitoring information or hire grant proposal writers or whatever, and that makes it easier for them to get more money from Global North organizations. So that is partly how it happens. It's partly information about identifying organizations that exist, and it's partly about playing the game, I think, like capacity. I'm not defending this, I'm just explaining to you, these are some of the barriers that I come up against. I mean, that said, there are some really, and I do not think that this is best practice, and so which is why I'm working with this particular organization and many others on this exact issue. There are quite enough. Here's another example. There's a family foundation that I work with that's based here, and they are just some people who happen to have more money than they need, and they give it away, and they want to do that anonymously. And a bit like Naila was saying, it's not kind of, there's nothing to hide. They just are quite private people, and they don't want a bazillion people knowing that they happen to be more rich than they look, and they don't want a million charities putting things through their front door every day and whatever. So that's why they do it rather quietly. And so for an organization like that, it is quite difficult to find out what organizations actually exist and are doing good work, because they can't do networking themselves. So they find their grantees usually through other people, so through other networks or through other big foundations who do have the ability to do that networking on the ground and to find out. So I just wanted to answer that question directly. I'm not defending it, but I do want to just explain, sometimes I understand it's a really frustrating dynamic for people in low-income countries, and I wanted to just explain something about the kind of odd mechanics of how this situation comes about.
Thank you, Caroline. And on that note, I want to come back to Briggs. So Briggs, if you want to comment on that, but also on Chris's question asking about, and we've talked about this before, you know, he's recognizing Brian's point about hyper-local organizations, but who are often very small. How do we help these small social purpose organizations get, secure the capacity to be able to produce the standards of governance standards or M&E capabilities that can then secure funding? I'm sure that's something you've looked at time and time again.
I wanted to come in right on that. So no, thanks to Caroline for sharing the intelligence, even though she didn't disclose the names. I think it's very important that we know, because some of what she's talking to then can be addressed. You know, if you're talking about people not knowing who are these organizations, someone can create a project. You create a whole database, online free access platform where you can find, you know, organizations that are impactful and things like that. I think from our experience, the bigger challenge that we have seen is in terms of, it's in terms of the understanding of the social change process. We have seen most, large funders believing in this more waterfall type of approach. You've got funders who have been implementing projects for decades without getting the intended results. But again, without changing costs, without taking in, pausing to take into account why, the results are not coming through. But part of it is that, you've got a large funder who will give $5 million today. In the proposal that you submit to them, they want you to tell them that 2.5 years from now, there's going to be a meeting of 17 people who will be meeting with this particular person in this legislature. Breakfast will cost this much money, transport will cost this much money, and everything is sort of cast in stone, and it doesn't change. If you look at COVID, what we've learned is that the social dynamic, the social process itself is a very fluid, emergent process that requires flexibility, that requires agility, that requires an ability to actually submit our models and our templates to the actual reality on the ground. And I think that's where the big mismatch is happening with large funders, because the communities that you find on the ground are a lot more organic communities, organic driven communities. So even the priorities that they identify are priorities that might not feature in a very high level, almost like elite analysis, unless if it's organically connected to what is happening on the ground. So I think there's a significant mismatch, and that's why this conversation we're having is very important, to say if these large funders were going to be transparent about these decades of failing to produce results, we'll begin to see that part of the answer is and accepting that money is very important, but money is not equal to knowledge. Communities have knowledge. Communities understand and are better placed to set priorities. Communities are better placed to set and define the approach. Quickly, let me talk about your question around how then do we connect funding to very small community collective organizations on the ground. I think that's where the element of intermediary actors become very important. Intermediary actors who can build trust with these communities so they are proximate enough to be able to, extend solidarity, be present when these communities are in need, build the relationship, but also handle some of the more complicated accountability and diligence requirements of large funders, because we should not aspire to transform or turn community organizations or social movements into these polished organizations that live to fulfill the due diligence requirements of large donors. It will be a complete disservice to the results that we are seeking. So we need the intermediary actor, I believe, to be able to come in and help facilitate that level of engagement and leave movements, communities to be communities and to do what they do best based on their vantage position of being the most affected.
Thank you, Briggs. And I love the idea, I love the fact you bring that concept of intermediary into play. And I think you've answered Shireen's question. She was asking exactly that. How do you make the trade-off between inclusion and transparency, and how do you navigate it? I hope, Shireen, that has touched on, Briggs has touched a lot on your point there, but come back to us if that's not the case. And then we have another question from John, who's asking how we address the heavy percentage of government needs from donations that surely the percentage of government needs from donations. Okay, I'm not quite sure, John, what your point is. The amount of money that's coming into government versus the impact that grants can have. Let's talk about that a little bit. About
can we unmute John and just ask him to ask his question?
No, I don't think we can. No, sorry. But John can maybe just rephrase it in the chat. But it's an important point to look at how under COVID, what we've seen is that philanthropic capital has been filling many of the gaps of public sector spending, and hence governments have lost some of their aversion. We've seen that in Southeast Asia. We've seen that with some of the organizations we work with. Their Tanota Foundation has done a lot more work recently with in Indonesia around education. We've seen it in the Middle East, where we've seen organizations that historically had never worked with governments now working particularly on education, digital education. And we've seen it also in Latin America. Lots of foundations that were historically trying to promote digital education got traction with governments during COVID. So John, feel free to rephrase your question. But meanwhile, I want to pitch that to Brian and Naila. Talk to us a little bit about what you've seen happening. I mean, because that's clearly a way of presumably improving transparency and power dynamics if governments get to understand philanthropy better and the potential of the sector. Let me start with you, Brian.
Yeah, I think I would say fairly fortunate here in Singapore, and the government does take a very active approach in encouraging philanthropy. And I think one thing that we've seen, not just I think not just alone in Singapore, but within the broader Southeast Asia region, is a recognition that philanthropic capital can come in, obviously plug in gaps where they're needed, but also have this almost a catalytic effect. And especially now with this move towards blended finance, that's just becoming even more and more pronounced. So with the idea that and especially with philanthropy, given that the philanthropists behind them can often have a much longer term horizon, a very different risk profile compared to a regular investor or the government. For government to be able to fund something, it needs to be, I mean, they're accountable for taxpayer money. It needs to have a certain base, it needs to have a certain proof point. Whereas philanthropy, if it's a relatively forward-thinking philanthropist, they're able to move forward faster with maybe less data, less information, and take on higher risk projects and serve as that catalytic effect. Doesn't always work. I think I've also heard philanthropists said, I tried to do this and I looked back and said, I was hoping that 10 people would follow, and it's an empty street. But I think when it does work and when it's structured in that way, I think it can be very powerful, and especially for a large scale solution, which an individual philanthropist has no way of meeting. So for something climate related, for example, there's no way an individual foundation, unless you're massive, able to make even a small dent in that. But if we could, for example, blended finance approach where 20% comes from philanthropic capital, 40% comes from commercial capital, or maybe a portion comes from public capital, that multiplies the amount that we can put towards that cause. And so in terms of, I think governments really see that. I think that they at least from the conversations I've been having here with the sort of on this regional side, that they see that potential for these maybe higher risk activities, that philanthropic capital can take that first step.
Thanks, Brian. That's good to hear. And Naila, have you seen anything in recent times where we're moving beyond that historical aversion to working with philanthropy, where we saw even philanthropic capital flows being blocked by governments, to some kind of better understanding, whether that's on the back of COVID or just better data disclosure more general, and on an increased understanding on the part of governments around the potential of philanthropy and hence potential partnerships?
So, honestly, this is a very difficult question for me, because not that I don't have the answer, I have plenty of thoughts and answers to it, but it's a difficult question for me because honestly, it's very difficult for me to frame a response that isn't a scathing critique of of the government relationship to philanthropy in the region. And I know, I tend to overgeneralize. Again, we're talking about 22 countries. I have pretty strong experience in about 11 of those 22 countries. So the others that I don't necessarily have a lot of experience with, I don't want to speak on their behalf or, to talk about their governance or their structures. But honestly, I mean, there are pockets of some progress in this, in this area. However, I mean, honestly, and I don't think I don't think we do anyone any kind of service by trying to gloss over any of the real, very serious challenges. We are in a region where this concept of an NGO, the N is being taken out of the NGO, right? So even in the government structures or in the countries in the region where there's been a little bit more of a conversation between the philanthropic sector and the government sector, many of those philanthropy, quote unquote, NGO organizations are under the auspices of a particular government, a particular ruler, a particular monarch. I mean, so, we can pretend that, yeah, there are conversations, and those conversations are not hostile and they're amicable, et cetera, but the reality is when it comes to implementing, at the end of the day, do we have an enabling environment for this sector in the region? No, we don't. And there's no use in trying to pretend like, everyone can point to the one or two examples where, oh, look, there's a lovely relationship, watch it as it goes. And the truth is that when you start to really interrogate that relationship, you'll find that most likely the organization that you're looking at that has a very strong kind of support and is being championed by the government is either sharing a lot of the operations of the implementation of that project, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as that's transparently known, or is kind of functioning in one of the subsectors that are not controversial, right? So it's filling a gap that kind of can make local government look really, really good. But do we actually have this kind of reckoning at the level of being able to say, oh, we're on the road to improving relationships between government and the philanthropic sector? No, I mean, I don't think in a general sense that we're there yet. And again, that's part of why forcing this idea around why we have to create the data. And if you don't mind, I do have just one. I wanted just to jump back for a second. I know we dismissed this answer or this question, but I really feel very strongly about this, to build a little bit on what Caroline was saying and what Brian and Briggs were saying. But the question around this power dynamic and this power structure. So I don't necessarily need to address it specifically around grassroots organizations, but to say that generally also, from my perspective, what I've noticed is part of the reason why there's this inequity in the dynamic structure is a laziness on behalf of global North organizations that are fully funded and wonderful and lovely and have all this great capacity. There's a laziness in their approach to seeking out community-based organizations in the local kind of regions where they're looking to work. There's an arrogance about we can do this better, so we can bring in very, very, very expensive folks that work in our offices in New York and London, et cetera, to come and show you how to do this better, which is, I mean, over and over again, I think we've proven that's catastrophic. And then just this idea of all these wonderful philanthropists who are looking to diversify their philanthropy portfolios, hiring these very, very super expensive consultants who are taking hundreds of thousands of dollars to consult on the strategy for this philanthropy. And those consultants come from nowhere, even remotely near the region where people are looking to fund. And what ends up happening is, an organization like mine ends up being the last go-to resort at the very last minute when the consultant needs to present this $250,000 strategy they've been working on, to say, oh, we weren't able to reach the people that we needed to reach. We weren't able to find the connections that we needed to find. Could you please give us your entire database, right? And then we end up doing all of this stuff for free, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things that I would say is really important, which I think goes a little bit to Briggs' point about the intermediaries, is to have an understanding by donors that it's worth funding and investing in networks, in local networks. It's worth allowing networks like the AFF, like other networks in around the world that are working with regional donors and regional philanthropy actors, to empower them to be able to serve as those kind of connectors, so that there's less laziness around the discovery of who you can work with.
So, and it's obviously, we firmly believe in networks. It was one of our core recommendations of our COVID-19 report, but I think never before have we heard the word network mentioned so frequently in philanthropy as a critical enabler of both impact and as you said, as you know, Briggs was talking about intermediaries, but also because networks can share data. So networks in and of themselves can also help improve transparency.
And can share data because of the trust, because when you build a network, you build trust with your members.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and people know each other. It's that social capital, isn't it? Absolutely. The fundamental kind of definitions of networks are suddenly coming to the fore. And Chris asks a question which relates directly to the second one of our recommendations of our report, which was unrestricted funding, unrestricted funding, unrestricted funding. But he says, isn't the onus on donors to build a capacity by offering unrestricted funding? I mean, I think this is something now that has gone around the rigging so many times for decades, but we have, you know, we recently saw the loudest report came out saying categorically that we know that unrestricted funding drives more impact. Who would like to take that one on the importance of unrestricted funding? Briggs, you want to talk about that? Are you seeing changes now in Africa? Are you seeing more unconditional funding, core funding, so that people can build capacity for better systems and transparency?
The conversation is happening, and I think that's significant. And I think part of it is a realization of what I spoke to earlier, that you need to have the capacity to be responsive. You need to have the capacity to be agile, to, you know, act, reflect, adjust your plans, as we saw, you know, with the COVID experience, where all these new questions that were not on our radar it suddenly became the top priorities. So if you have, you know, the model that is based on strictly restricted funding, I think there's a big lesson that we've learned that that doesn't work. So the conversation has started, but what we have also seen is that it is very difficult to shift from our existing templates in practice. I'll give you an example. We were speaking to one of these large donors, and when we spoke to them about emergence, they absolutely loved it. They were convinced with everything that we were saying. But when it came to the time to submit the formal application, you then needed to fit a particular template, proposal template, budget template. And the effect of those templates was to move you back from this fluid flexibility and restricted emergence conversation you started to a completely restricted, because you now had to meet, you know, this particular template. So I think that's really something that philanthropy has to, you know, take on in terms of what are the matrices that we are using, what are the templates that we are using, and are they fit for purpose? I also wanted to quickly speak to a question that Caroline is asking in the chat. You know, she's saying, does it matter if a Global North organization is funding an organization in the Global South that is run by a white person versus an organization that is being run by a person of color? So I think that's a fundamental question, at least from, you know, from our own experience. In practice, we have not experienced it as a very innocent question of whether an organization is run by a white person or not. What we have seen is, you know, unfortunately, is that there is a certain continuity of, you can call it coloniality continuity in philanthropy, where you have seen that there's what appears to even be favor or preference of a privileged position that is taken by organizations that are run by, you know, a white person, to the extent that groups decide to make their fundraising person or the lead of the organization, you know, a white person, just because it's going to smoothen the interaction and the relationship. And I think that's something that needs to be taken on and accepted, acknowledged and accepted head on. I think it was Naila who spoke about decolonizing philanthropy in this day and age, especially of the Black Lives Matter movements. It's really something that philanthropy has to face up to and look at how do you deal with it. To us, at the end of the day, it shouldn't matter whether an organization is run by a white person, it's run by a person of color. It's really whether that person has a relationship to the issues, to the constituencies that they're seeking to serve, that will make them or that will position them in a place of being able to render effective service to that organization. But unfortunately, race is very closely related to class and privilege, especially on the continent, and I'd assume in most parts of the global south. And it has created all these distortions that philanthropy must now attend to.
Thanks, Briggs. And a very important topic, one that has been covered recently. I just shared the link in the chat to a report that we were involved with, which was supported by Vodafone Foundation, and that we worked on with our friends at Clearview Research House in London that do a lot of work on race and diversity and inclusion, and also CAPSI, our friends in South Africa, our counterparts in South Africa, with Becky Moyo and his great team down there. So the report is in the link, so do have a look at that. It talks to exactly this topic and gives some broader thinking, it's quite a long report around some of the broader issues in philanthropy in Africa. John, thank you so much for recalibrating your question. I think I got it now. So what John was asking is basically, if governments tax not-for-profits, how do donors feel about the fact that when they give a donation, some of that donation might be subjected to taxation? Maybe that's one for Brian. You're our finance man. Brian, what do you think about that? Is that the case in Southeast Asia, that there is tax on social purpose organizations' revenue on their donations coming in?
It's actually a tax incentive in that it's so if you donate to a social purpose organization under certain criteria, then it's I think 250% rebate almost on your income tax. So
but the organization itself, does it pay tax if it's in the third
the
sector?
organization? No, I can't speak for the other countries, but in Singapore there's a lot of exemptions.
I suspect Singapore is probably more progressed on that, but certainly in some markets, even third sector organizations are paying tax on their actual donation. And going back to the issue of transparency, I see Naila, and I know of some already, that I guess that's the challenge, where people aren't aware that governments are sometimes taxing third sector organizations in the global south.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's it's something that especially when we talk about networks, it's that's needed for the sharing. And it's interesting because we need networks for non-profit, for communities. We need networks for the social purpose organizations. One thing that at least we're trying to build on as well is networks for regulators, networks for central banks, for governments. I know that it's interesting that there's so many forums out there that they can convene, but these specific topics aren't always brought up. And I think when we're able to convene on, and especially as philanthropy is becoming so much more important as a driver of change, I'm quietly hopeful. I hear a lot of what the other panelists are saying. I do agree that it is challenging sometimes working with governments, especially from all around the region, and definitely when I've worked Vietnam, Myanmar, Indonesia, Singapore, it hasn't been a uniform story of how supportive the government has been. But at least for me, just the more recent conversations have been a lot more hopeful.
So, and I think Singapore is sometimes held up as sort of something as a role model in helping governments understand how to regulate philanthropy. So I think Brian, a collective request for you should set up a conference for regulators in the global south to come together. I don't think this has ever happened, has it? A global conference to get regulators together to learn about how to best regulate the sector, because I think notwithstanding some of the huge challenges I think all of us that have been practitioners in the sector have faced, I think governments are often willing and want to learn more, and quite often simply don't understand the complexity of the sector, especially as we move from traditional foundation structures to blended finance and impact investing. I think sometimes we lose our friends in the public sector along the way, and maybe there is a good opportunity to have a global debate around what is best practice for regulating the third sector, especially when, as you say, in Asia, Brian, you know, there's this massive intergenerational wealth transfer. So much money is going to be coming into this sector, and even in Africa and the Middle East. I mean, there's huge amounts of wealth coming into this sector, and governments really struggling, even where they are willing to create a conducive environment, struggling to know what that would look like. Okay, so we're nearly out of time. So we're going to take one more question, and then I'm going to ask our panelists to just share with us their closing thoughts on the broader debate, but specifically transparency. So what do we need to do? What do we need to be thinking now as we take this forward? What does transparency mean? And what can we do as practitioners in the sector, as intermediaries, as networks, and even as academics? But let's just go to Matthew's question. He says, as a social enterprise organization enabling local community projects, as a solution to attract philanthropists, we are developing an integrated report following the Value Foundation framework to tell our story. It will be open, transparent reporting. We'll show how we use resources and develop capital to create value in order to recycle financial resources in our local community. Can you advise on other practical solutions? So I think, yes, so maybe that's one for our panelists as you give your closing remarks, because we do want this to be a very practical session. Also, please think of tools and resources that social enterprises and philanthropists can use to further develop their reporting and their reporting back mechanisms so that they can then obviously better access funding. So give Matthew's question some thought in your final closing remarks. And Matthew, do stay in touch with us as a centre, along with everybody else who joined the panel to join the call today, because that's certainly our mission at the centre, to help the third sector develop measuring and monitoring and evaluation tools, certainly a large part of our executive education program. But yes, so Caroline is back. So should we start with you, Caroline, for your closing remarks? I guess.
Yes, sorry, my computer just shut down randomly.
That's okay. Jack's did too, which is why we lost the polls, but never mind, we'll do them next time. But Caroline, your closing thoughts and maybe some top tips on resources and tools for evaluation and measurement.
Well, I mean, clearly this whole issue about moving power closer. I mean, Brian, I was very struck by Brian's point that when you are a hot startup, you get to choose which investors you have, because power is where scarcity is, right? And the reason that funders have more power usually than grassroots organizations is because there's fewer of them. Right, the money is more scarce than need and things that need it, so that's the kind of basic dynamic. But it is important that we move more of that power to the communities and organizations that can use it. Briggs's point is totally right, and I concur, and it's well made, that the highest form of transparency is inclusion, so including the people in the decisions that affect them. I am encouraged by the conversations that I see amongst donors, and I just came like immediately this morning. I already gave a session to a conference of foundations, which was precisely about diversity and inclusion and transparency. Like, I am encouraged that there is now more talk about this, and I hope that it translates into actually giving power away. You know, there was a book written about the Gates Foundation a few years ago, and there was a line in the review of that book which really stuck with me, that the wealthy are giving away their money, but they're not giving away any of their power. And I think it's about, high time that we, gave away more power. It is scary to do, because then you don't control what happens, right? You don't know what other people will do. So that's one barrier. But it can be difficult to literally find who you're supposed to be giving power away to. But I'm very encouraged that we're all having these conversations, and I hope that we get to see more of it. And I'm sure it will make us more consequential.
Brilliant. Thank you, Caroline. Well, we will certainly be continuing that conversation with you as our fellow. So thank you for joining us today. I'm going to do all ladies first. So Naila, let me come to you next for your closing thoughts, please, and any top tips.
Sure. So I think, just, we've said so much, and I don't want to, kind of go back and repeat, but I think I would just say one of the things that keeps coming up for me, or a few of the things that keep coming up for me as the points to consider while we look at this question, is first to identify the privilege that certain donors have, that certain powerful actors in the sector have, to identify that privilege and understand it, and to come from a place of humility in understanding that privilege, number one. The second is to kind of, openly reconsider the question of the power dynamics and how they are effective and how they are ineffective, and to allow for the space for that restructure to empower those who need to be empowered, but to come to that from a place of trust, and to come to that from a place of goodwill, right? So to allow for that agency that Briggs was talking about with an inclusive process, but also to understand where, when you have power, you also have the ability to share the knowledge and the information that you've gained through that power. And so to be generous with that, so that it allows, when you are empowering other communities or other factions, that you're empowering them in ways that benefit from your failures and your experiences, etc. And then to leverage the local networks, and to allow local networks to continue to thrive, because in situations where we have this kind of restricted model, these networks can serve as sort of a neutral space, right? Because we're not under the auspices of any one person in particular, or any one government in particular. We can be a bit of a neutral space. That would be my take.
Thank you, Naila. We will continue to work with you, of course, on the network, on the AFF's work on data collection. Data. Looking forward to that. And just a final, so I've got a minute each for Brian. You can go first, and then we'll let Briggs close out since he started. So Brian, your last 1 minute's worth of thoughts on transparency.
That's it. No, absolutely. So transparency, absolutely critical. Holding donors to account, I would say, as everyone's been talking about, absolutely critical. One thing I would say is not to lose sight of, we're here about impact, and that the whole thing about growing the impact, that has to also be sort of front and center in the conversation. And to that end, I would encourage social purpose organizations to also look across the financial spectrum. I mean, there's philanthropic money, there's impact money, there's sustainability, because I think benefits of that is it also helps shift the power. If that, there's a scarcity effect, that there's the larger pools that go in will also have all these virtuous effects of building capacity, having more attention from government, so we can have these conversations about treating them in different ways. And so there's so much, I see so much promise in the explosion, really, of interest in other forms of financing, other forms of capital, that can also help to shift a lot of the power to the social purpose organizations themselves.
Thank you so much, Brian. We've only just, organizations started to work together, but we very much look forward to continue to work with you around this space of blended finance, because it's something we're seeing a lot of interest in. And the final word goes to you, Briggs. Close us out on this conversation. Transparency, what next?
In closing, I would just like to say transparency is about democratizing philanthropy, particularly in the sense of recognizing the disproportionate and entrenched power of money in philanthropy, and shifting power to those who are most affected, those that philanthropy seeks to serve. So it's about inclusion and strengthening the agency of the most affected. But very importantly, it's also about improved decision-making. It's about better approaches, or more fit for purpose approaches. And ultimately, it's about better outcomes. Thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute to this discussion.
Thank you so much, Briggs. Brilliant insights from you throughout. And again, we've just got to know each other, but we very much look forward to continue to work with you. As you rightly point out, our focus at the center is impact, and outcome. So you've all been absolutely brilliant. Very insightful conversation. It is just the beginning, folks. So yes, we will continue these kinds of discussions with this series. If you want to find out more, join us on our social media platforms. Come to the next Shift the Power event on the November the 11th, talking about local voices, local needs. And we also have, if you want a broader experience of executive education, we're starting the next session on the 27th of October. So really great to have all of you with us. Thank you so much for joining, and see you next time. Bye-bye for now.
Bye-bye.